Okay, so I guess we can start already. So last time we had discussion on the overview of psychological assessment. So we had the introduction as to our course, our subject, which is psychological assessment. So these were actually the topics that we discussed last time. So first, we had the importance of psychological assessment. If I'm going to ask you, ano nga ba ang importance ng psychological assessment sa ating mga psych majors? Anyone? Based on our discussion last time, ano ba ang importansya ng pag-aaral ng psychological assessment? Ayun, nakatulog na sila. Anyone? Kahit isang sagot from the class?
Ma'am,
Yes, go ahead.
we need to study psychological assessment po to assess people before helping them or before diagnosing and giving treatment to them po.
That's very good, because we cannot provide help or let's say counseling or psychotherapy without first giving them assessment. So we have to evaluate their conditions, the underlying conditions doon sa tao. Aside from that, we identify that it's very important for us psych majors to have the discussion and have the understanding of psychological assessment. It's because it's part of the board exam. So we have 4 board exam subjects: psychological assessment, industrial organizational psychology, abnormal psychology, and what else? Theories of personality. And if you go back with the table of specification for the board exam, pinakamalaki yung percentage ng psychological assessment. So if you will ask me, bakit po kaya ma'am yun yung pinakamalaki? It's because when you graduate, supposedly, and if you will really go on with the path of the psychology, ito talaga yung work ng isang psychology graduate, yung assessment, doon magsisimula. So, the psychometrician board exam, ang isa sa pinakamalaki, 40% is psychological assessment. Also, last time, we had a chance to differentiate psychological testing from psychological assessment. So, when we talk about psychological testing, as the name itself, it just has something to do with the testing. So, when we give the test, administer the test to our clients, to our test takers, kasi tayo yung test administrators, sila yung test takers natin, that alone is psychological testing. We identified the test has something to do with the questionnaire or the task or procedure or the skill needed or yung skill na gusto mong i-measure during the process. So, kapag naman sinabing psychological assessment, administration will not end. So you should score, interpret the test. So when you had the scoring, interpretation of the results of the test, that is the time wherein psychological assessment will come in. You also have the chance to identify psychometrics. So yung psychometrics is the science of assessment. And the one who is responsible for psychometrics are called psychometrician. So yung tao na involved with psychometrics ay psychometrician. And as a psych graduate, after 4 years of taking psychology as a degree, ito yung ite-take ninyo as board exam, psychometrician. I also presented to you the characteristics and the qualifications of a psychometrician, yung binigay ng IRR or the Psychology Law of 2009. We also had the chance to identify the major landmarks in psychological tests. So, nagkaroon tayo ng glance of the history of psychological tests, wherein it started with China with the essay type of test for civil service until such time na-introduce yung mga IQ tests, personality tests, projective tests, and the like. And finally, we were able to discuss the importance of culture with assessment. So we had the identification that culture dictates the behavior of a person. So yung ugali, yung pananaw, yung values ng isang tao, depende yon sa kung ano yung kultura na meron siya. At yung culture ng isang tao, nakaka-apekto yon kung paano siya magsasagot sa test. So there are times na taboo or hindi tanggap sa kultura ng isang tao yung ganong aspeto. And pag lumabas siya sa test, so definitely there will be different perceptions or interpretations to it. So in giving tests, either individual or by group, we have to consider the culture of the clients or the persons or the test takers. Now, since we're done with the first part of the introduction, we're going to proceed with the legal and ethical considerations in assessment. So in the legal and ethical considerations, there are three words that you have to identify. First is the law or laws, and then ethics, and then code of professional ethics. So when we talk about laws, these are rules that individuals must obey for the good of the society. Unlike ethics, these are body of principles of right, proper, or good conduct. So we know that when we have something to follow or to do given by authority, those are laws because those are rules that we should follow. Unlike ethics, kumbaga yung ethics is part of the law. That's something that is right, good, and we cannot go away, we cannot go wrong when we do something relative to ethical. When we combine laws and ethics in our profession, we have the code of professional ethics. So this has something to do with the standard of care expected of members of that profession. So meron tayong tinatawag na PAP, Ethics Code, or the Psychological Association of the Philippines Ethics Code. Nakalagay doon yung mga standards na dapat natin ginagawa in our profession. So kayo, as a student, diba, ang isa sa aim niyo is, of course, makagraduate. And once na nakagraduate kayo, magpa-practice na rin kayo ng psychology. At sa pagpa-practice ng psychology, we have to be very careful. We have to abide with certain ethical standards. So sa Philippines, yung mga ethical standards na yon ay nakasulat doon sa PAP Ethics Code. The PAP Ethics Code encompasses practice on research, counseling, and of course, assessment. Ayan. So these are some of the concerns under the legal and ethical considerations in assessment. So first is the concern of the public, which is the abuse of test. So yung mga tests natin, technically, pwede silang maabuso. How? If we are going to use the test in a way that it should not be used that way. Let's say, for example, a standardized psychological test. I gave it to you, and then I ask you to answer it with yourself for educational purposes. Tapos ang ginawa mo, since natuwa ka dun sa test, pinotocopy mo na yung test. Tapos namigay ka sa kapitbahay mo na reproduce mo yung test 100 times without considering that this is a standardized psychological test which should not be photocopied or reproduced kasi binabayaran yon. You try to imagine ang isang standardized psychological test, ang pinakamura na is 50,000 pesos for the manual and the answer sheets. At hindi dapat ito pino-photocopy. Pero there are times that for educational purposes, pino-photocopy natin, pero mali talaga yon. So in that sense, inaabuso natin yung test. So dapat ay hindi. Bakit sinasabi na naaabuso yung test? Kasi una, dumaan sa mahabang proseso yung pagpapa-standardize ng test. Later on, we will have the processes on how to standardize a test, paano ba nagba-validate ng test, paano ba magiging reliable ang test, or yung psychometric soundness ng isang test. So, yung test natin, kailangan, we have to treat them as if a copyright, as if they are really valuable and essential. So, yan. So, dapat iwasan natin yung abuse of tests na tinatawag. We use the test in an essence na hindi dapat. Yun yung kanyang pinaggagamitan, let's say. Or, yun nga, nire-reproduce natin ang isang standardized test na hindi tama. Another is the concern of the profession. So there are 3 test user qualifications, level A, B, and C. So I remember I mentioned this na meron tayong mga tests na hindi pwedeng hindi trained or license ang gumagamit. So if you look at this, the two tests, level of test, yung level A and level B, pwede pa yan for psychometrician. Yung achievement and proficiency test, aptitude and achievement inventories, applicable to normal population. Pero pagdating natin sa level C, which is the projective and the individual mental test, especially the projective test, ito ay pwede lamang i-administer ng psychologists. So pwede rin naman siyang i-administer ng psychometrician but with the close supervision of the psychologists. So these three levels should be considered kasi when you graduate, let's say, tinanggap kayo sa isang company, ang inyong work is for recruitment and selection, and then ang isa sa inyong responsibility is to administer psychological tests, projective test yung ipinapa-administer sa'yo. Aside from you will not have that thorough training or qualification sa projective test sa college, pwede mong itanong sa boss kung meron ba kayong psychologist kasi that should be administered in the presence of a registered or a licensed psychologist. So itong mga levels na to ay na-encompass din doon sa Psychology Act of 2009. So I believe and I hope that you already read the Psychology Act of 2009 which professionalized the field of psychology. So dyan diniscuss yung need for board examination. Another one, as the concern of the profession, is testing people with disabilities. So actually, testing people, normal people, is already hard. Pero what if the person that you are going to test or you're going to administer a test ay may disability? So mas mahirap. Why is it difficult? First, because you're going to transform the test into a form that can be taken by the test taker. So let's say, for example, bulag siya. So papaano mo ibibigay ang isang psychological test kung bulag? So merong mga specific na test na para lang sa kanila. Or kung talagang hindi maiiwasan na hindi magbigay ng psychological test na yon para sa kanya, sa isang may disability, itatransform mo pa yung test in a way na mababasa niya. Kasi siya ay bulag. So, papaano yon? Yung, ano bang tawag doon? Yung tutuldok yung kinakapa ng mga bulag. So, it will take another process kasi itatransform mo yung test sa paraang mababasa niya. Transforming responses of test taker as to be scorable. So, in that example, so paano mo i-scorean ngayon? Siyempre, ang isang may disability o yung bulag, paano siya magsusulat? So, paano mo siya i-scorean? So, yung transformation ng test itself and transformation ng sagot niya mismo makes it difficult to test a person with disability. Actually, hindi lang naman yung bulag. Halimbawa, bingi or pipi. So, kailangan mo talagang i-transform yung test in a way na maiintindihan niya. And at the same time, yung sagot niya, mai-scorean mo or mai-interpret mo. Another difficulty is, of course, meaningfully interpreting test data. Kasi nga, they have difficulties. So that difficulty may have an effect on the way they answer certain tests. So dapat ito i-consider natin once that we are going to administer psychological tests to people with disabilities. Another is computer-assisted psychological assessment or CAPA. Actually, computer plays a vital role in assessment. So, tinutulungan nila tayo in terms of scoring, interpretation, minsan administration na din. Pero, in our field, it would be better if we use the manual. Tayo mismo yung nag-administer, then tayo yung mag-i-interpret and mag-i-score. There are issues kasi in terms of the computer-assisted psychological assessment. First is the access to test administration, scoring, and interpretation. So, alam ba natin kung sino ba or valid ba talaga, credible ba talaga yung nag-score, yung nag-administer, or nag-interpret noong test? O, kasi sa computer, pag may mali ka lang input, mali na lahat. What more kapag mag-interpret ka ng isang very solid na psychological test? So, dapat you have to be very careful with your input, let's say, on the computer. Another is comparability of pencil and paper and computerized versions of tests. So kapag ba in-administer mo yung test, pencil and paper, yung manual, I give you a questionnaire and then I'll get it and then I interpret, I score or interpret. Compare with, nag-type ka lang sa computer, dun ka nagsagot. Same ba sila na magiging scoring and interpretation? So those are some of the issues regarding CAPA. Actually, ang dami ng mga naglipa ng psychological test sa computer. Minsan nga nakakabigla yung Rorschach, which is a projective test, yung may itim na figures, nasa computer. This is a projective test. Psychologists lamang dapat ang nag-a-administer noon, pero nasa computer. At saka mamamangha ka, wow, ang bilis ng interpretation, ang bilis ng scoring and interpretation ng test. So in that essence, yung computer-assisted psychological assessment ay nagiging way to abuse also the test. Kasi hindi dapat ganun yung pag-handle ng test, in particular, yung Rorschach dun sa example ko doon. No? So dapat we have to consider those things and yun nga. Another issue, the value of computerized interpretation, and there are times yung nagiging unprofessional, unregulated na yung psychological testing online. So yung galing nga ng example ko kanina, imagine standardized test, bibilhin mo ng sobrang mahal and then makikita mo lang sa internet, available na pala. Eh hindi, alam mo naman sa sarili mo na hindi dapat ganon. Na hindi ganon yung tamang pag-administer, pag-score at pagtetest ng specific type of standardized test na yon. So, nagiging unethical yung paggamit ng computer as aid in our assessment. Next, another thing that we have to consider are the rights of test takers. So, first right is the right of informed consent. So, I believe you know what an informed consent looks like. So, dapat yung test taker, alam nila kung ano yung ginagawa sa kanila. Alam nila kung ano yung ine-evaluate sa kanila. So they should have the consent. Kung hindi sila pwede pang magbigay ng consent, there are the parents or the legal representative. Meron din naman mga situations na hindi natin hinihingi yung informed consent. So nagiging parang discretion natin nung mga professionals o nung mga nagbibigay ng informed consent kung kukuhanan pa ba natin sila ng informed consent. Kailan yun? If the society is in danger or let's say for example, in danger yung test taker. So, kailangan hindi na natin siya kuhanan ng informed consent kasi yung welfare niya ay nakasalalay doon sa pagkuha natin ng informed consent. Another right is the right to be informed of test findings. Of course, after you administer the psychological test, there are results. So the test taker should know the results. They should know the results in a way that they will understand. So most likely yung language na gagamitin mo. Meron tayong mga terminology sa psychology na hindi natin gagamitin sa pagdidiscuss sa kanila ng test results kasi hindi nila yung maiintindihan. They are also entitled to recommendations kasi sabi nga kanina ni Daniel, we assess people so that we can help them and provide them, let's say, treatment and intervention. So, after the assessment, dapat malaman ng test taker paano ba natin sila matutulungan. So, how can we show that help or yung pwede nilang gawin, let's say, to alleviate their negative feelings, it's through the recommendations. So, dapat maipaliwanag yun doon sa mga test takers. Of course, the information of the purpose of the test, the meaning of the scores, limitations, and margin of errors. We have to emphasize to the test takers that the test has limitations. Meron siyang mga error din. Hindi naman perfect ang mga psychological tests. So, we have to explain to them na even if, let's say, ang lumabas sa kanyang IQ ay mababa, it doesn't mean that it pictures the totality of the person or his or her totality. And then, of course, you should be open to questions because it's also one of the rights of the test takers na kung may tanong sila doon sa test findings nila, yung sa results noong kanilang sinagutan o ibinigay mong test, you should answer. Another is the right to privacy and confidentiality. So this is a privilege of the client And lahat talaga nung inyong ginawa in the assessment should be just between the two of you. Not unless may danger ulit yung sa society. Halimbawa, may kaso. So, you don't have that right to keep the results of the test kasi meron ng higher authority na involved. O kaya naman, the client asked to disclose the information. Let's say to the attorney, to the insurance carrier. So, pwede mo na siyang i-break. Pwede mong i-break yung privacy and confidentiality pag ganun yung case. Also, ayan yung sinabi ko kanina, psychologists may ethically disclose information if it can prevent harm. Let's say, for example, lumabas dun sa test na very aggressive yung tao at papatay na siya ng kanyang kapwa. So, killing is very unethical and it's a sin. So, hindi mo pwedeng itago yun na may chance na manakit yung client mo or pumatay yung iyong client. So, dapat mo nang i-disclose yung findings noong tests. Another right is the right to the least stigmatizing label. So like what I've said, yung results ng tests, it will not give you the entire picture of the person. Hindi yun yung kabuuan ng tao. Though it can give you description of the person, pero we have to have a thorough assessment talaga ng tao and a continuous assessment. So hindi dapat dahil ito yung result, magkakaroon na tayo ng generalization tungkol dun sa tao na yon, or bibigyan na natin sila ng label or discrimination and all. So those are the 4 rights of the test takers that we have to consider once we deal with assessment. So first is the right to informed consent, right to know the test results and findings. Third is the right to privacy and confidentiality, and then right to the least stigmatizing label. Are you still with me, class?
Yes po.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's good. Okay. So now we'll proceed with the uses of the psychological tests. So saan ba ginagamit yung mga psychological tests natin? So first is education, yung mga school ability tests, achievement tests, diagnostic tests, or informal evaluation. Those are considered as psychological tests. Nung kayo ay pumasok sa CVSU Gentry, nag-take kayo ng entrance exam. So basically, that's a psychological test to know kung saan ba kayo fit na program. Parang ngayon, hindi na uso yun kasi ang fit or qualification sa something to do na with the strands. So kung ganda yung strand mo, ito dapat yung course na kukunin mo. Pero before, there are entrance exams to know kung kaya mo ba na matagalan yung course na gusto mong kunin o yung choice mo na course or degree. Another use of psychological tests aside from education ay geriatric. So yung mga matatanda, elderly, if they can function well, ano pa ba yung cognitive, psychological, or adaptive functionings nila, pwede nating i-measure, and isa yon sa use ng ating psychological test. So eventually, to help them probably to live comfortably in spite of their age. Another use of psychological tests, counseling. So before we provide counseling to our clients, kailangan i-assess muna natin. Bakit? So that we know the condition. Bakit ba siya nagpapa-counsel? Though the client may give you problems, at ito yung mga problema niya, bakit siya magpapa-counsel? Through the test, malalaman mo pa rin yung mga unconscious or the underlying conditions ng tao. So baka akala niya, ito yung problem na dinudulog niya sa'yo. Pero sa totoo pala, hindi lang pala yun ang problema na kailangang isolve. Aside from counseling, the clinical and health, meron na tayo mga neuro-psychological assessment. I-discuss natin yon sa mga susunod na panahon. And then for business and military, bago ka makapasok sa trabaho, kailangan mo ding mag-take ng psychological test. Sa military, bago ka maging sundalo, kailangan mo din to know kung meron ka bang mga psychological issues or kaya mo bang i-sustain halimbawa kung sasaba ka sa giyera and everything. And then governmental and organizational credentializing, kailangan din. Kailangan halimbawa you ask for promotion or you are working in a government institution, hindi ba nga yung mga psychological reports, ayan, chinichir tayo ng manok. So anyway, yung psychological reports ng mga nakaupo sa government, issue yun eh. Kung pwede bang i-disclose yung, let's say, yung record ni Duterte, kasi siya yung ating presidente. Pero technically, pwede naman, kasi they are the leaders and they should be known by the society or the people of the Philippines, kasi sila yung leaders natin. So, paano ba nakapag-come up sa reports? It's through the psychological test. Meron silang mga kinuhang psychological test and then nakakome up sa psychological evaluation report yung mga psychologists. Another is the legal and court-related expert testimonies. So, pwede din kasi tayong maging expert witness sa court, yung forensic psychology na tinatawag. Halimbawa, ang iyong client ay maghihiwalay, so mag-asawa, nullity of marriage. So, we can apply the psychological tests if there are really grounds for the nullity of marriage. At yung results ng psychological test na yon, pwede mong i-present sa court para mapawalang bisa yung kasal, let's say, ng mag-asawa, na it happened, let's say, for example, na client mo yung isa. Ayun. Yung mga psychological incapacity na tinatawag, yung mga napapanood natin sa palabas, bakit maghihiwalay? Aside from the satisfaction and the love, is the psychological incapacity. So, paano mo mapuprove yun? Through the psychological tests. So, ang daming uses ng psychological tests. No? These are the specific uses of psychological tests, of course, for assessment, setting goals, determining intervention, reviewing the progress, and for closure. So basically, tayo talaga yung gumagamit ng mga psychological tests at tayo dapat yung well-trained sa pag-administer, scoring, at interpretation ng psychological tests because it's not just used for evaluation of the person but also for setting the goal of the person, for providing them treatment interventions. Makikita din natin kung meron bang pagkakaiba, let's say counseling, binigyan natin sila ng sessions. Yun ba ay may positive effect doon sa tao or nag-negative pa yung experience ng tao dahil doon sa counseling? You can use psychological tests. And of course, closure. Grabe naman ang manok. Ano bang oras na? It's 10:38 but nag-aano pa sila, chini-cheer nila kayo sa pakikinig para daw hindi kayo makatulog. Okay, so let's move on with the limitations of the tests. So, yung tests ay hindi perfect. So, there are certain limitations dun sa mga tests na kailangan din natin i-consider. Though useful sila, first, the tests are not refined tools that give exact measurement. So, lagi kong sinasabi na kahit na thorough, there should be a thorough assessment of a person. Pero kahit thorough pa rin yung assessment of the person, meron ka pa rin margin of error doon sa test. Kasi hindi naman perfect yung test. Let's say IQ test. It will not, let's say for example, I give you an IQ test, 3 IQ tests, magkakaiba yung interpretation. So, hindi talaga magbibigay ng exact measurement na ito ikaw, ito yung IQ mo dahil lamang dun sa mga tests na binigay ko sa'yo. Kasi nga, merong limitations yung pwedeng ma-provide ng certain tests. Another, tests do not provide comprehensive measurement. So, it's somehow relative to the first, Another, the test yields a score, the numerical value indicating, let's say, the student's performance, but it does not show why he has made the score. So, let's say, for example, binigyan ko kayo ng personality test, meron siyang value, pero hindi ko makukuha kung bakit kaya yun yung score. Not unless I conduct an interview, which is another tool for psychological assessment. So, hindi nasasagot kung bakit ganun yung score. Yung IQ test, halimbawa, binigyan ko kayo. Ngayon, ang score mo mababa. Tapos bukas, binigyan ko kayo ulit. Ang score mo na mataas. So, hindi ma-explain ng test bakit yun yung nagkuha mong score. Ang makukuha lang niya is yung present, kung papaano ka, kung ano yung sinagot mo. So, yun lang yung i-scorean niya. Pero hindi kung bakit yun yung naging sagot mo o score mo. Another, tests may show how a student can do in a test situation, but that they cannot make decisions for him. So, yung actual. Meron kasing mga tests na you have to think of a situation, anong gagawin mo. Siyempre, you will answer on that day kung ano ba yung nafe-feel mo, ano sa tingin mo yung tama. Pero when the time comes na mangyayari talaga yung insidente na yon, will you do the same thing? Of course, marami tayong mga explanation, yung mga impulses natin, adrenaline natin, ay magko-control on the situation. So, yung sinagot mo sa test, pwedeng hindi yun yung gawin mo in a given situation. I remember, nung kumuha ko ng psychological assessment, I guess 3 weeks ago, may tanong sa akin, kapag daw nasunog ang isang bahay, ano daw ang una kong gagawin? Nandun ako sa loob, nasusunog, bahay. So, alam ko kasi na ine-evaluate ako. So, alam ko na i-scorean at i-interpret yung sasabihin ko. So, ang sabi ko kagad, I will look for other people at palalabasin ko muna sila. So, bayani ang peg ko, no? Bayani yung aking gustong ipakita na mabuti akong tao and all. Kasi alam ko sa sarili ko na i-interpret yung sasagutin ko. Pero, technically and realistically, kapag nasunog ang isang bahay, ang isang tao talaga, ang initial niyang gagawin, lalabas siya sa bahay kasi ililigtas niya yung sarili niya, hindi ba? So, yung ganung aspeto. So, when you answer a certain test, mapapaisip ka kasi ng about the situation. But it will not give you the exact decision na gagawin mo once na nandyan na yung situation. So, that's one of the limitations of tests. How about the major errors in the use of tests? So we have to avoid these errors. First, failure to choose measurements that serve the specific purpose in mind. So dapat yung test na ating pipiliin at ibibigay sa ating clients or sa test takers, ayun talaga yung test na kinakailangan natin for the purpose. Another error, the use of tests for purposes not intended. So, dapat talaga yung test ay it will measure what it intends to measure. Let's say, I will ask you to measure the depression level of your client. Ang binigay mong test ay for anxiety. So, sala na agad. Kasi yung test na binigay mo will not measure what I want or what I need to measure or what I ask you to measure. Another, over-enthusiastic support of tests and failure to recognize their imperfection. So, masyado nating tinataas ang tingin sa test without considering that there are limitations. Another, too strong generalization from group tendencies. So, dahil ito yung binigay nating test, ito yung lumabas doon sa test, nag-generalize na tayo. That's also one of the rights of the test takers, right? Na we shouldn't give them labels or stigmatize or discriminate them because of the results of the tests. Okay, another, preparation of tests made as an instructional goal. So, para saan ba talaga yung test mo? Ano yung goal? So, it should reach your purpose, the test that you prepared or you are going to use. Neglect of desirable outcomes of instruction that cannot be measured objectively. Ano ibig sabihin nito? So we have to consider everything that the test will give you or the results of the test. Neglect of the data that cannot be obtained through tests. Kasi nga may limitations yung test. Ang IQ test, IQ lang yung mame-measure niya. Hindi niya mame-measure yung personality, hindi niya mame-measure yung ibang areas ng isang tao. Ayun. And making the part replace the whole. So again, the test will not give certain parang individuality ng person, no? So, portion lang, and it should be supported by more assessment or more administration of tests.